Let's jump in. Let's go ahead and get started as you guys are signing in and doodling away. Um, we'll go ahead and start talking about what we're going to talk about. So I was telling some people, there are a couple questions that people have had that I thought actually might be not a bad way to start us off and lead us into our discussion today. And Jeffrey and I were meeting yesterday, and we were talking about, with a notebook, when does something in your notebook that's assumed to be private become public? And so we'll have a discussion kind of based somewhere around that. I think we phrased it in a more elegant way. But Derek, you had a question at the beginning of class. Go ahead and ask that question again. And we're going to use this as a good example of a working question that we can use, not to expect just a yes or no answer or a quick answer, but to say, let's have that be part of the discussion. And then hopefully by the end, you've got a very clear sense of what that answer
So the
might
question
be.
I asked was if we're just working on one kind of image in a way, or working on multiple smaller ones, and we combine that and near the end, or we just have those set by the end of the term, whatever, just need some clarification on that.
Cool. So the question, let me rephrase it to make sure we've got the right question, is, are we working on kind of one image, or is it multiple versions or pages, or is that a fair representation of the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So so let's just keep that as a thought, because it's interesting. I would say, just as a quick answer, it's not that we're working on one image, but rather that we're working on this. We are working on one thing, which is the notebook. So, and the notebook could be any number of pages, any number of images, any number, so it's that weird thing, like a book, everything is unified within the book.
So it's one book with multiple pages.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the way I would think about it. And but I like that question as a way to think about it. Actually is a pretty interesting question if we think about it in context of what a notebook is. And Jeffrey, did you want to say anything about that? Or should we jump into the question?
Yeah, I can say something about that. One thing really quick, though, is that Figma only allows up to 50 people to edit. So we're going to have a little bit of spillover. So I'm actually going to create a second document. So because we're mostly going to be using Figma today just as a kind of doodle kind of space, and you can put your name in there. So I'm going to create a second document for the other half of the lecture. That way you just kind of can feel like you're with some other people doodling. Let me just do that really fast.
Cool.
All right, I put it in the chat for the Zoom, and I'm also going to stick it in the Moodle just for next class too. I don't think we were aware of the double or the 50-person limit. At least we haven't tried it with this many people before, so it's good to know. But anyway, the question is basically about how to treat your notebook. Kind of like if the book should have kind of a central idea or like be split up into multiple ideas. Is that kind of what we're getting at, Miles?
I think so. Derek, what do you think?
Well, when I was working on the notebook over the weekend, I was trying to figure out if I was going to be working on one image over the course of many weeks, or if I was going to be working on multiple images. So I could do one every so many days, or one every day, and then near the end it would be viewed over and determined in the grade by that, or if it's combined, just kind of like how that's kind of organized.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jeffrey.
Well, I think it depends on, it kind of depends on what your working style is, because, the way that this software works, you easily could be working on one page for the whole term, and you could create kind of more of a sprawling thing. But I wouldn't necessarily think about that as an image. I would maybe think about that as a surface that might contain multiple images or multiple ideas. Um, I wouldn't necessarily say that an image is defined by like the the fact that everything's just on the same plane.
Mhm.
Does that kind of make sense? Am I
Yeah.
confused? Am I confusing you even more?
Well, so I'm just gonna guess that it's not exactly set in stone, which is nice because it's more flexible. But at the same time, um, well, I guess with like one Figma page, you can draw as much as you want on it to like no limit. So I'm not sure if that's one way to do it. Uh, but
Yeah, that's a nice way to think about it. I mean, I think you can also just think about it as a balloon. And, if you have some air inside you that you need to blow into the balloon, you can blow it in. And if for some reason it gets a little bit too stretchy and feels like it's going to pop, you can move into a new space. And that will happen, like if you do add so many things to a certain page, the resources are finite. Uh, so there's a reason why there's multiple pages. Um, but you can always copy stuff out of one page and paste them into another. I would think about it more as a as a design tool where you can construct and change things constantly, as opposed to something where it's more like a physical sketchbook where once you draw on it with the pen, you really can't go back and erase or move things around. So try to take advantage of the fact that everything's kind of like a Lego block.
mhm,
And if you have an idea or start working on something one day, like let's say your kind of strategy for working on your notebook is that you're going to set a timer for 30 minutes every other
right.
day, just to
Mhm,
like record some ideas or to draw or to like maybe come up with color palettes or some kind of idea that you might have. That might be really messy, but then you might have another time that's like an hour at the end of the week where you clean all that work up and kind of think about it. Um, and maybe think of it in a more presentational form. But that's also what Miles and I want to kind of start talking about today, which is how do you kind of work in an idea space where you're making notes or coming up with plans or sketching. When do you kind of know when to share that with other people or how to present that to other people? Especially how can you present things to other people that are not finished and are still messy, and what are some like ways to organize those messy thoughts?
Yeah,
Yeah.
great. I was just throwing up there in kind of a way to think about this, and this is a good example of what we mean by working questions. And sometimes a working question might seem to have a simple answer, but the creative potential of the question is actually a lot more interesting. Um, have you guys heard about, it's kind of an old saw, I guess, in talking about education, but I forget it's an English educational theorist was talking about this, that there's a test that they give people to determine their creative abilities. And they'll say like, how many things can you do with this paperclip? Right. Have you guys heard of that? Has anyone heard of that? But
I might have. Yeah.
and so most people like, from high school age on will come up with, I don't know, 20 things like, oh, you could use it to fasten two pieces of paper together, or you could, but if you give that test to a kindergartner, they'll come up with like 300 or something,
Right.
like, which is kind of like considered like genius level, because they're thinking like, oh, I could make an airplane out of it, or I could, make a flower, or I could, like they see it as this kind of
Everything.
infinitely, yeah. And so I think that's part of what the class is doing. We're trying to break back open those creative possibilities. And so everything that is kind of an assumed restriction is actually potentially something to crack back open and use as a working question, because they're good questions. And so, yeah. So I just threw out here as an idea, and again, this is not the answer to Derek's question, but I think it's an important thing to start to think about, which was this. And so this is an example of a scroll sketchbook. So this is all one image technically, right? It's like one piece of paper, like that might be the way we think about an image. And like Jeffrey is saying, I mean, there are so many different ways we can think about what is an image, is like a comic book. We can think about, is that comic book like, this here, this, I'm not showing you, but here it is on my tiny little screen, this, comic book, it's got all these images inside of it, but in a sense, isn't this just one image in a way? Like we could take this comic book and publish it onto a scroll and you could unroll the scroll, that way. So in a sense, and I think you pointed out, Derek, Figma is kind of infinite, right? So you could actually create over the course of 10 weeks in this class, one image technically, which would be kind of weird. It's a weird way to think about it. You could also do a bunch of separate images in your sketchbook at home, in your physical sketchbook, using photography, using sculpture, like whatever. And you could combine all of those things to create one image at the end if you wanted to. But we're not expecting you to do that. But if that's something that you're like, that's cool, I want to do that, we're like, right on. Or maybe you do that over the course of a week. So this annoyingly open-ended thing is kind of what that really is the substance of the class. So these questions are really actually super cool questions. Mm-hmm. And the answers are even more exciting. I mean, the potential answers.
Yeah. And there are different ways of thinking about working creatively, of course. So like what Miles just showed, that sketchbook is kind of like it's sort of like a process of like aggregating stuff, of just like slowly building up material, like oh, okay, I ran out of space, now I need some more space. Oh, okay, I ran out of that space, now I need some more space, until you run out of material, right? Just like building up a pile of stuff. And that's really good, especially when you get started with something, to kind of just give yourself unlimited leeway to just like do stuff and kind of play. But that's not necessarily how you might want or feel like doing research or creating something. I mean, the curves, so if you're an industrial designer, for example, industrial designers will use AutoCAD or Figma drawing software. Basically the same software here, but instead of like maybe drawing sketches, they'll spend a lot of time looking at angles and editing specific, really specific angles, and also thinking about variations on those. So like, a classic example is like this curve of like the iPhone is like a very, very specific kind of like branded curve ratio. And you can go online and read articles about like how, like what that ratio is and how specific it is to like the iPhone devices. And it's designers and artists who do that. They sit in a room all day and they look at curves, and then they build, basically little maquettes that have that curve, and they try to understand like what makes their curve unique or what makes it work better. And that's not a process of just building up or aggregating things. That's a process that's kind of more scientific, of like recording things, trying things out, understanding everything else that's out there. And so even if you're engaged in that process of sort of like looking at other stuff and kind of comparing what you have to that stuff, you can still you still have to keep track of things. You still have to kind of know where you've been and where you're going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, Jeffrey was talking about that design process. And so I think this is actually a really good thing to think about just for a moment, and which is tools. And at what point do we start using kind of the real tool in a design process, And so one of the reasons we're excited about using a tool like Figma is that it's so flexible. So we could use Figma if we were a game design team. We could use Figma if we were a marketing team. We could use Figma if we were working on a storybook together, or an animation layout, or planning our photography shoot, And so I think a big part of the way we think about art and drawing and things, maybe a little bit differently than, I don't think it has to be different. I don't think artists really do think about this that differently, but maybe from something like maybe in a drawing class in the art department or something, is that drawing and design like this, we think about it as a communication tool, and not just a communication tool for the final product, for the final illustration. Like, by the time you see an illustration for like a comic book cover or a movie poster or a game box or something, that's a finished piece of work. And what we're kind of more interested in is drawing as a communicative, planning, designing, development tool in a way, and asking the question is, at what point do those things, maybe they're the same thing at a certain point. So I just wanted to show, like if you look at level design, for example, in game development, what you're going to see a lot of, especially if you actually go and hang out in the studio, you're going to see stuff like this. And here's the thing, like environment art skill away from a computer, that these are the types of drawings we'll tend to use to really develop things. And so I don't think most of us coming into this class are even really used to that as being something that's valuable. I'll just throw that out there. Some of you might already see that as valuable. If you do, good. But for many of us, that's kind of a revelation. Like, oh, well, I do this kind of stuff all the time for like my D&D campaigns, or, for, I just sit there and doodle while I'm talking to my friends and I'm designing a house or something. But that's the kind of thing that we want to encourage you to start to explore, like to kind of uncover the value of your design, not as the finished product, but just as the process. Because I think this is, you can use this type of thing to communicate with other people on a team. And so this is a lot of times the kind of work you'll actually end up doing once you graduate. And then there are steps, then you can start to bring it into this level, this step, which is, okay, now we're starting to use, like Jeffrey was saying, the AutoCAD tools, the 3D, Blender, Maya, whatever. We're starting to use 3D, and we're doing 3D block out. And that's called white boxing or gray boxing. And you can see examples of that. So now we're getting a sense of the layout of things, but this is made up entirely of blocks, of primitives. There's no sub-object sculpting going on in here. Okay, so what this lets us do is it lets us move through the space in a way that we can start to get a narrative and a feel for how this is going to flow, and whether this feels like cool or whether it doesn't, And so I think I talked about this in the 3D class, but this is the Diablo 4 development blog, and they talk about this. So this is an example of a gray box. And so if you ignore the character, these are just generic shapes that you can just make instantly out of a 3D program. And they're used to lay out the space and feel out the space. So, and then this is the more finished version with all of the extra textures and renders and everything. So, but the point is that this is really where that stuff starts. This is really where that work is going to happen, and the collaboration is going to happen. You're going to be talking to your teammates on a development project using this language a lot more than you're going to be talking to them using this language, if that makes sense. Like, this is something that the team really works up to getting something, but it's going to start there, and it's even before that, it's going to start there.
Yeah, and one thing to kind of think about, those of you who are interested in designing games or software, is that there are kind of different roles for designers and for artists on projects, and increasingly the role of like the designer of the things that other people design with is much more prevalent now. So like when Miles was talking about these Diablo levels, there are not just level designers, but there are the people who design how the levels are going to be constructed, right? The designers of the tools that are handed off to people who just creatively build the levels. And sometimes the levels, actually often, you know, I think in Diablo, every level is somewhat procedurally generated, right? So there's holes in which algorithms fill in the gaps. And so it's not really the job of programmers usually to do that work. Of course, they encode what happens, and sometimes they wear multiple hats. But entering instructions into a computer and telling the computer to generate stuff is the application of a design system. And a design system is really almost, think about a design system as a tool that you use, like a pen and a paper. And so within the system of a pen and a paper, all these things can occur, right? Except those are actual tools, right? And a design system is a little bit like taking that idea of like the physical tool of your pen and paper and making it completely imaginary, like making it completely abstract. So you say, oh, rather than have a pen and a paper, what would be like the design system there? You could say, okay, it's like a rectangular plane of a certain size or a certain ratio, and then something that can potentially make a line of a certain thickness within that plane, right? Sorry, just an example. I'll show you a quick example of some designers kind of playing with design systems, specifically with drawing, or kind of coming up with little design systems. It makes the concept really easy to understand. So let me share my screen real quick. All right, I'll walk you through this. So this is this is kind of a book, but also kind of a group. It's a studio of like 3 designers, and they created basically a club in which they would hang out and they would draw pictures around the edge of a table. So this is kind of after hours kind of stuff. And so in the book, each designer usually has a certain color, and then they develop these little drawing games. For example, most of you can probably read this text. So in the first workshop, it was with 4 people. Each player had to use a colored pen, and the players took clockwise turns lasting 30 seconds. So you can kind of see the results. So the idea here is they have some physical tools, but then they're also kind of sort of like making these arbitrary rules as if their physical tools were somehow more limited than they really are. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
Kind of like a little bit like writing a program for yourself and then having to follow it.
A guideline.
Yeah, like guidelines. And so the rules get more complicated, and eventually sometimes they're expressive. And at some point, they publish a book of all their findings. But it's interesting to think about this I don't know what you really want to call it, this activity that they did, because, well, first of all, it's not so easy to point at and say, well, what is this thing, right? Like they put out a book, but they were also kind of like a group that met, and also they traveled around and gave lectures about this work, and also used this work in order to get more interesting clients for their design studio. And so the kind of question here is like, you know, these Norwegian designers doodling, right? And so the kind of curious question is like, well, why would this be interesting to to clients, to brands who might want a rebrand, or to an art museum who might want a website. This is what graphic designers do. So
Because
why is it that this? Oh, go ahead.
Because it gives an example of their workflow and like what that actually looks like instead of just the finished product.
Exactly. Yeah. It gives an example of what their process is. They're like, when we design stuff for you, we're like 4 people sitting down, thinking about the problem, coming up with these different ways of doing it, and then also carrying it out and seeing what the results are. And then what we're going to bring you are these different results based on rules or systems that we've developed derived from your organization, or like what your desires are. So it's a really nice, interesting, almost model for a design team. Yeah, that's a great answer, Tam. That's exactly what they're doing. They're really just showing off their process. So they're like, if we don't have a client, then how can we like show what we do? And so this is like a great, almost like illustrated example of like what the designer's role is. Yeah. But yeah, so they're they're coming up with these abstractions, right? These sort of imaginary tools. And a lot of things that we use today work that way, right? Figma works that way. Minecraft works that way. Word processing software works that way, right? These things are based somewhat on simulations, right? Like the blocks in Minecraft, the water in Minecraft will pool and fall down, but the blocks won't, right? They'll stay in the air, right? And the words in Microsoft Word like can be erased, unlike paper. So there's like so there's points in which the simulation kind of holds, right? But then once the simulation breaks down, you're no longer actually sort of mimicking a physical object, right? You're actually designing an imaginary object.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And I think this is, in a way, this is kind of tends to be a lot of the work that gets done today is really built around these types of things, like designing systems, designing experiences. Actually, if you can you bring that back up? Can you reshare that, Jeffrey? I wanted to see the circle drawing that they were doing again. I thought that was really cool. But there's a really important,
sure.
Yeah, there's a really important point about this, and this kind of, I think, ties into what our discussion was going to be about today, which is private versus public, or at what point do you show something? And so, like Tam pointed out, they've made this very clear decision to show the process of this, so that if you go to the end product there, I think number 3 there was it, or where they finished the circle draw, or that's pretty much finished. So if you think about this, are these people like awesome artists? Well, they might be, but we don't necessarily know, right? I mean, they're taking something that literally anyone could do, which is draw a circle with a marker, and they're using that unit as the construction unit for the final image. And the image is actually really cool, right? So like they've figured out a way to generate this cool thing, but they did it not necessarily knowing what they were going to end up with. So it's like they were experimenting with the process itself. And so this is a very cool kind of meta way of thinking about things. And then the key thing is that they documented the process of it, right? So like, if they just showed us the circle, like even having the woman there, we see her actually drawing it, that we get the sense of like, oh, that's what the idea is. It's not so much the final image. And I think we have a tendency to jump to the final image. So if we just said, oh, I made this circle, drawing, we'd be like, okay, well, that's cool. That looks cool. But doesn't the process have something more interesting to say about it? And if you think about Minecraft really kind of blew me away, when it came out. I just couldn't kind of believe what I was seeing in a way. Because what Minecraft is, it's a product, like Jeffrey was talking about. The product is the process, right? So it's not like they designed a really cool scenario for you to try to solve. They said, look, here's a product that can let you have your own process. And so that to me is a really interesting design turn. It's not about drawing awesome stuff as the creator of Minecraft. It's about creating a system or a world that other people can create awesome stuff within. Anyway, that's just an interesting meta thing there. Yeah, and so the key thing I wanted to say about this, to sum it up, is like, it's not about whether you're good or bad at something. It's not about, oh, I'm bad at drawing, right? Or I'm good at drawing. It's about, well, you don't have to be good or bad at drawing in order to be part of a design process and part of a thinking process. Cool.
Sorry, I was muted. The other point that I was going to make, continuing on what Miles said, is that that doesn't mean that there's no skill in being a designer. It's just that usually you think of drawing or making marks on paper as somehow having to relate to like making something look like something else, like being an illustrator or a painter, or maybe making a logo that looks awesome or a t-shirt that looks awesome. But drawing is not necessarily just for that. And I mean, in the same sense that like you could have a student who goes to Juilliard or Berkeley for music and is a great pianist. Like they can play all the classical music compositions. I have a good friend who does that. But when it comes to when it comes to like uploading something to SoundCloud, they can't get any. They can't they can't compete. You know what I mean? They're not cool enough, right? So like so the idea that just like that there are these different genres of music and that's totally accepted, right? Oh, like there's this one way of thinking with the piano and composing with the piano. You can even just be a player of compositions and try to find a career just as playing things other people composed, right? Or just be a composer and not a player or not a great player. And so it's like, for some reason in music, it's very easy to sort of separate out these like really specific skill sets, right? The composer is kind of like the designer of abstractions, right? They're kind of more in the design role, right? They're thinking about what are the instruments that are needed in this piece and like what do these people play. They're also considering maybe who those players are and what their skill level is. That can often even be really important. For example, there are contemporary composers who specifically want players. There's a Japanese composer I really love who specifically gets players who are amateurs and mixes them in with professionals in order to create a certain kind of sound, right? And so in this design or composition of this process, skill or thinking about people's abilities becomes a variable and becomes useful, right? Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up in particular is because you should also think not necessarily about these little drawing exercises that I'm showing you as just a way for this design studio to, let's say, show off their process, right? But these little drawing processes are also kind of emblematic of the processes that we go through every day, let's say on our phones, that are designed for us to go through. So like, for example, the posting flow on Instagram, right? Like when you go to make a new post and then it shows you a series of screens, like here's the screen where you like preview your post. Here's the screen where you can like edit your colors a little bit, right? And then here's the screen where you add your caption, right? And then you post and then it goes to a little loading bar and you're back in the feed, right? So that's broken down into a sequence of like 4 or 5 steps. And what this design studio is doing is they're designing interesting sequences of 4 or 5 steps, right? So not only are they sort of showing their process, they're actually proving how interesting they are, how good they are at designing sequences that are captivating and that are like, that create sort of interesting results or different variations. So, the reason why I'm talking about skill is because if you're designing something like Instagram, or thinking about, let's say, having an input of other people's skill, right? You design a sequence that supports a variation of skill, right? And then you attempt to figure out ways of qualifying that skill, whether it's by likes or comments or, you know, follower count or like whatever it is in your system, right? Those are ways in which you can try to get at or describe the abilities of an individual who's playing within that system, right? So what designers do that's kind of different from, you know, a painter or an artist, or just what, I don't really even want to separate out the roles so much, you know, but when you're designing something, really what you're doing is you're thinking about these sequences of events and thinking about the space and how things are constructed, and also thinking about what these abstract modules are that you're going to be using. Does that kind of make sense? And for those of you who are interested in graphic novels or comics, you know, one of the great things about comics as an art form is that it really sits in between both of these ways of thinking, right? Not only do you have to draw interesting pictures and be good at that, but you also have to understand what the system is for the narrative that you're constructing. Like, are you going to have speech bubbles? Are you going to do it like Japanese style where you go from right to left? Are you going to break the page into 3 sections each time? Like, what tools are you going to use for the whole book? You might have to decide that beforehand. And so like coming up with the sort of algorithm or the sort of process for your graphic novel or for your comic is often just as much of a skill and a process as is just drawing the thing, you know, to begin with.
Absolutely. And I think for design, that's where you're going to see this. I'd say it's a huge split. And I kind of experience it almost as like a traumatic split. You know, when I was learning art and getting into drawing, I was really into developing my own like kind of facility or skill in drawing and painting. And so I was really kind of threatened in a way by this idea that someone could not have that skill and be doing like amazingly cool stuff that I used every day. But then I got excited about that because I'm like, oh, well, maybe the skill isn't actually the thing that's most important to me. Maybe there's another way to think about it. I love what Jeffrey just said about sequences, about thinking about sequences. And so this would be a perfect thing that you could do in your notebook. And you could do it over several days. It could be a daily practice if you wanted to. And that's think about something, an experience that you've liked. And this goes back almost to Derek's question at the beginning. When does that experience start? And when does that experience end? So if you think about that, think about something that you've had a cool experience with, and what is the start and what is the end of it? And I think you'll find pretty quickly that it's not necessarily one thing, or there's not a hard and fast beginning and end usually. And I thought about it as some people like going to Disneyland. You know, I think people talked about that, and maybe it was in the recitation or something. But like, well, where does Disneyland begin and where does it end? Where does the excitement, you know, how do you design that experience for people? How does, like, you know, when you're waiting in line for the ride, like all these types of things as you walk around, how are you developing that experience? Think about one of your favorite restaurants, or, you know, I think Cynthia, you work at Albertsons, right? Like, well, when does the Albertsons experience begin, or going to Starbucks or going to Case Coffee? You know, why is it the way that it is? And just this was kind of this is an art installation actually. But I don't know, it's kind of cool one to think about. Who is this again, Jeffrey? This is I'm on the I even forget the artist, but are you guys all seeing this? The Prada image here? Yeah. So
Yep.
it's in Marfa, Texas. So it's in the middle of nowhere, Texas. And so they created this installation that is basically a Prada store, but in the middle of this, you know, middle of nowhere, Texas. You have to drive really far out to go see this. you know, but I like this as an idea of kind of design itself, of like how much of it is about things that aren't necessarily things under the control of the designer, or ways to think about it. So it gets really funny when you look down here and see like the gravelly dirt Texas driveway, and how that interfaces with the clean lines of the Prada store or something. So the horse, the rusty fence.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's by these artists and architects, basically, that kind of came together.
Yeah.
They're not really known for much else. Elm
Right.
Green and Dragset are their names, but
Yeah.
it's still there. It's been there since like 2004, 2005,
Yeah.
and I think it's like kind of dilapidated now.
Right. It's kind of busted up.
It's one of those things that people drive by and take pictures of, like a lot of American roadside attractions. But in this case, wasn't designed as a roadside attraction so much as it was like designed as a cool JPEG.
Yeah, exactly.
First and foremost.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I actually wanted to, let me point out something that's happening in one of our Figma documents real quick, because I actually wanted to talk about a design concept, the concept of affordances.
Affordances.
Yeah, so if you look here, Zach is building this really cool triangle face guy.
Love it.
And you can see it's kind of built out of these different parts, right? These different components, basically shapes in Figma. They're kind of constructing this thing, right? And so here you have an example of someone who's actually constructing a character in the software with blocks, basically, right? Using the pre-built sort of like abstractions in the software. And now if you go over here, oh, there he is. So here's our little Minecraft guy, right? And so this is an image of something that is constructed using volumetric blocks, right? But the actual construction of it that we're looking at here is an impression, right? It's a description of those blocks. It's not using those blocks themselves, right? So here you have a described system, and here you actually have a system being used, right? And so if we go up to the top here, here's another, here's a doodle of Green Lantern, basically. Is that Green Lantern? Yeah, it is, right? That's the Green Lantern symbol. So you can also see in this drawing of Green Lantern that there's a process, right? There's a kind of underdrawing process, right? Like if you look at this line here, you can see that that's like a guiding line for the facial features. And those of you who are used to how to draw books or like doing life drawing, you're familiar with this process of slowly constructing the figure out of basic linear forms, and then sort of like using the lines that you draw also as a measurement system for understanding where you're going to draw stuff, right? So here's a good example.
Yeah, I'm never patient enough to actually get that process right.
Well, it might not be the process for you.
Well, I want to make sure my art's actually good so I can trace stuff over. I mean, I know I was taught the right way to draw, but I'm just naturally, I'm horrible at it.
Well, you just have to keep doing it in that case. Like part of it is just practice, or workshopping a way that does work for you.
Yeah.
Like I can't draw off the cuff. I have to use that process, or else it just doesn't satisfy me.
I can draw, because I drew these. I can draw some things without construction, but it's very helpful to me personally, but not always. Like the American Vampire drawing to the right, that's completely just me loosely sketching out a shape and hoping that it works. Same with the dragon, like there's no structure there per se.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I know, but yeah, I mean, we all have our own methods, but it's just I see myself a lot more as a writer than like really as an artist. And I was hoping this class would I learned through this class that I could probably track down some people who could, who would have the patience to deal with me. So maybe they could help draw some artwork I had planned for my series.
If that's if you want to learn how to draw, I would recommend taking like a figure drawing class with Ted when that actually becomes available again.
I wish I could too. I was
Yeah, I
going
miss
to.
it.
I was going to because I'm double majoring in also art. And I was going to do that, but it was already full with students that were already here. So I couldn't do that by the time I was registering.
Oh.
All right, should we talk about affordance for a sec?
Yeah. Give me some affordance.
So the process of the Green Lantern drawing, and whether you're good at drawing or want to be good at drawing, and using different processes, that's kind of beside the point, at least in this case. By constructing a drawing this way, right, that method of construction has what's called an affordance, right? Every process has affordances. And an affordance is basically what behaviors that process begets, right? So like if you have if you're cooking, for example, right, you can make something called dough, right? And dough has a number of affordances once it's made. There is this process that you can use by which you make a thing called dough, and that can be considered as one experience or one process. But once you have dough, right, dough can afford many other forms, and many other things can be added to it. And this class is called Image and Animation Design. And so there are ways of constructing drawings or thinking about creating visual forms that afford different processes of moving those forms around or animating them, right? So if you were to create an animation and you were to use this constructive method, right, you might guess that what type of animation this process affords is cell-based, frame-based animation, in which you're going to be redrawing forms at different angles based on impressions, right, by constructing the forms. So think of like the Lion King style animation, right? That's the type of animation that this process begets or affords. Whereas this process affords a totally different kind of animation, right? The sort of the kind of Family Guy, Fairly Odd Parents, Cartoon Network style animation, in which forms are broken up into different blocks or units, and the space might not be as deep or as convincing. I guess South Park is probably the most easy way to understand this sort of cutout based animation, right? Where you kind of construct these two-dimensional puppets, right? And a lot of animation is done this way now because this form of animation really works well with teams of people. So that's why a lot of animated TV shows kind of use this method. And so just to show that's a bit different from this drawing here, this drawing is actually like a drawing of another animation process or rendering process, right? So if you wanted to make an animation using this method, right, it might be more like tracing images from Minecraft or from, right? Because what this image is a kind of like reference to another process in which things are already being animated, right? And already have their own way of moving around. But basically any process that you use begets different behaviors. And so when you're thinking about creating a project like an animation, you also want to think about, well, what are the algorithms or processes that I'm going to use to create the imagery? And then how is that imagery that I create going to actually be animated, right? And so what do these kind of processes actually afford? So anime is another great example. I mean, we don't really have, I don't know if anybody drew an anime picture in my document.
I love anime.
You love
Drawing
anime, yeah.
one right now in mine, but it's
Okay.
in mine.
Let me just show.
I feel really insecure about all this
screenshot.
because I feel like I need to know how to draw well, especially online if I want to do well in this class.
One sec, I'll address that. So within anime, right, you have a slightly different style. Well, first of all, there's different animation studios and stuff, but anime looks a lot different from like a Disney movie, for example.
Okay.
And one of the reasons why is because the process is different, right? Anime is usually you have like a very, very clear foreground, right? And usually those foreground images are kind of still, right? There's not a lot of in-between frames. And then you have a really highly detailed, usually hand-drawn background, right? And if you were to compare like Miyazaki films with The Lion King, or Disney films, you see a different structure there, right? Now, part of the reason why that structure is there is also because of the social hierarchy of the teams working on stuff. So like, if you look at Miyazaki, if you look at Miyazaki's storyboards, just as a quick example, you can see that this is a really interesting process by which one person basically creates the whole film by hand and notates what will happen in the film and at what time. And then teams of animators underneath will kind of fill out those animations that go in between. That's not really how Disney's process works. And so the films have a different feeling because of that, right? And yeah, they're just to kind of like compare like maybe two styles of animation that seem kind of similar in a still image, but move very differently, right? They have these very different algorithms in place. Specifically, Miyazaki's studio is very like top down, you know, like Miyazaki creates the whole movie in a sketchbook like this, and then hands it off to everyone and then watches them as they produce it. And that comes with real tooling too. Miyazaki's studio has their own software that they use to produce their films that they developed. Pixar has their own software that they use to make their films. This software doesn't come out of like the need for customers to buy animation software. This software comes out of like a process that people have come up with on how to organize, like, let's say 100 people, and 20 of those people are artists, 10 of those people are screenwriters, you know, 5 of those people are voice actors. It's like, how do you develop the software to support all that? Once you actually have the process, you know, that you want to use. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of easy to think about doing that work when you're like in a team of 4 people, you know, 4 people get together, 5 people get together. It's like a group project, right? You're like, okay, you can do this, I'll do that. Like, we'll do this first, and then tomorrow we'll do this next thing, right? We're all really used to thinking about kind of coming up with organizational structures when it comes to groups. But for just yourself, right? Oftentimes when it's just you, things are a little bit more chaotic, you know, and like you're not really necessarily thinking about designing a process because you're not really responsible for anyone else other than you. But part of this class is starting to do some of that work just for yourself, you know, come up with the processes that you want to use and think about them, and then also carry them out in ways and decide if those processes are for you and they feel good, or if they're not for you, and also understanding what your abilities are in relationship to that process. So another point really quick, I'll share a graphic novel by one of my favorite comic artists, Jeffrey Brown, who now is most known for doing Star Wars comics. But I'm trying to remember the one that I really loved.
Oh yeah, what is that? Clumsy?
Yeah, exactly. Yep, that's the first one that they wrote. So here's a pretty interesting comic that I really, really liked in high school, in which it's like about a relationship, and the whole comic is kind of done in this sort of sketchy style. And, you know, the artist redrew the pages. It's not like they just drew each page one off and then we're done. You know, these pages they had mistakes and they had to redraw the whole page. And they also had pencil sketches in which they designed the story. But they intentionally knew what their abilities were and like planned the project around their abilities, right? They're like, this book is going to be a beautiful story about a relationship in which I only use this one pen and I never use a ruler. but everything before that I'm going to plan and think about. But the sort of rendering style, right, the sort of the graphics of the book is going to be something that I'm comfortable with, right? Because they were kind of experimenting with story and with doing a large project, right? And so as I was saying, your own abilities when it comes to projects is super important to think about, right? You actually have to think about, how can I design something that's going to be good, that's not going to overwhelm me, that other people will enjoy, given what my own abilities are right now. And so also knowing how to build in training scenarios. So like knowing what's a reach for you. Like, oh, like I really can't draw dragons, so I probably shouldn't make a book about dragons, but maybe there could be one dragon at the end and I'll work really hard on that dragon, right? So kind of building in these sort of reach scenarios in which you know you might be capable of it, but you're not just like relying on not being able to do that thing every day, you know? So coming up with projects and designing them is often a way of creating, kind of gamifying things for yourself too, you know, making sure that some things are comfortable for you, and usually the thing that you do the most should be the most comfortable, but then also building an experiment into it, something that you're uncomfortable with. Game designers talk about this a lot, right? If you're making an indie game or you want to create a video game and you're a great programmer, but you're bad at graphics, then usually it's suggested that you do some pixel graphics, right? Or find another artist, but that's less reliable than just doing some simple pixel graphics. And if you read interviews or talk to some people who are your favorite creators, you know, game designers or people who are really productive, they talk about this stuff all the time. They talk about how like, oh, with this project, I was really good at this and I was really good at that, but I had never used X before. So this project was really about me using everything I knew how to do, plus throwing X onto it, you know, and making that the thing that I worked on the most.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's great.
I'm just talking about this because this is an interesting way to think about how to treat your practice in general and your notebook too. And in your notebook, you should be thinking about this stuff. Like, what are the things that I might want to work on while I'm here in EMDA? What's maybe a project that I want to work on outside of class that might take a year? Or like, what am I building towards? You know, asking yourself those questions is pretty good. It's a pretty good time to be doing that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in a little bit on that because I think that's really important. I love the Jeffrey Brown. You pull that one back up, Jeffrey Brown.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, if you pull it back up for a second, one of the things I like about this, it's a good example of like, is this good or bad drawing, right? You know, is it, and don't answer the question, but it's a good example of like a working question, right? That, is this, what is this, you know, like and I think it's a great example of, I think it's really quite good, you know, in the sense of like, quote unquote good. But I think it's because it's exactly what Jeffrey said. It's like at some point he said, well, this is what I got. You know, like I might want to draw like so-and-so, but I can't, basically, you know. I just don't have that. And I've tried, God knows I've tried, but you know, it just doesn't, I'm not that guy. I'm this guy. And I think once you kind of have that moment, that's when I think the world can kind of open up to you, you know, when you realize, well, this is who I am, this is what I got, and it's going to change, it's going to evolve, but I'm still building out of this core of myself. Then I think you can really start to do work that distinguishes itself from other people. So it's no longer about kind of a generic, like, oh, this person's good at drawing. It's really about, oh, that's Jeffrey Brown, you know, oh, I like his stuff, you know, like that's where you're going to get that kind of development. And I think that's the thing that we're all struggling with in a way. Yesterday when we were talking about it, one of the things we came up with was that you have to be good enough right this second. That if you're worrying about not being good enough, that's the wrong thing to worry about. Like I would just say you are good enough. Your skills are good enough. Like you are adequate to start this project. Like, you're not going to get graded down or something for not being good at drawing. You're not going to be, that's kind of the whole point of the class, is to start exactly where you are now and then to see where that takes you and to see how that evolves. So yeah, I thought that was a really cool example.
Yeah, I mean, to use another example, Charles Schultz, the guy who drew Peanuts, like Charlie Brown and stuff, in almost like every interview that you watch or listen or read with Charles Schultz, they talk about how terrible of an artist they are and how they always kind of lamented how bad they are at drawing. And it's kind of true. They really can only draw the Peanuts characters and like those simple backgrounds. They can't really do like, and they didn't really ever try much else.
Mm-hmm.
But just thinking about the creation of a career or the creation of a, like, really like a creative person as a set of abilities. And within that set of abilities, there's things that you kind of come to terms with and say, maybe, oh, I'm never going to be able to do that. But I'm okay with that because most of the time I'm not trying to do that anyway, because I don't care about that stuff, right? So in Charles Schultz's case, he's like, well, I do comics. Comics is like a lower form of art. In his mind, I'm using his words. Comics is seen as kind of a lower, sort of more like more trashy form of art. So I don't have to be that good at drawing. I only have to be this good, but also it's not really about drawing. It's mostly just about the stories and how the drawings combine. So within his realization of that was this idea that he could move on from, self-flagellation about not being a good enough draftsman. There's a point at which he stopped beating himself up over it and just got to doing the stuff that his life was meant for. And he got better at doing that stuff, and he was the only person who could really draw those characters in that way. And so you also have to think about your art practice or your skill as something that's slowly being developed over time to the point where you're the only person who really is the expert on that particular process of drawing. Not that people can't forge things or people can't be good at mimicking things. Forgery is actually a pretty specific skill in itself. When someone's a forger, they usually can forge a lot of things, right? But being able to create a 4-panel peanut strip is really something only one person could do, right? And so sometimes it's interesting to think about your creativity as like slowly coalescing into this one thing that only you can do, right? And then trying to somehow merge that with the rest of the world and be able to like share things with the world. That's kind of the puzzle, right? And that's something that Miles and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today too, is when do you actually know how to make something public? You're working in your sketchbook or you're drawing stuff, or even if it's a work in progress, like how do you know when it's okay to share something or publish something, especially today? Because it's not like you're calling a newspaper asking them to publish your comic. You just post stuff online. So it's like, how do you know, like, where do you draw the line on posting and putting stuff out there, and how do you know when something's finished? A lot of you probably play video games and are probably like, oh, well, in my other class the other day, people were talking about DLC and how a lot of AAA games come out and they're unfinished, and then it seems like they release downloadable content to finish them. So if even the biggest games in the world, the biggest studios are putting out things that aren't finished, that you feel like aren't done, then like, how do you make your decisions about that for yourself? Maybe it's good that they're putting out unfinished stuff too. Have you thought about maybe why that might be a good way to go, or like what's useful about that? So it's just kind of an interesting relationship to consider. And we also wanted to just recommend that soon, this week, we're going to have you put your notebook links, basically submit your notebook links to us. And those links will be available on Moodle for anyone to click into. So it's an important time to start thinking about, if your notebook is really messy and you've just been sketching, maybe you can put all that messiness into a page. But also you could create a private document for yourself, just for your own thoughts, and then think about the notebook for class more as like something for finished work. But just first of all, know that you can have multiple documents on your account and use them. And it's kind of up to you how you want to treat that space. And there'll be moments in the class when we, ask you to show what you've been working on. And actually, I don't know, Miles, what do you think? Should we ask some people to show some things if they want?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, would anyone want to volunteer maybe to kind of screen share or show us something
I'll go
you've been
ahead.
working on in your notebook? Okay, yeah, great, Tam.
Yeah, let me actually do that. Yeah. So, I mean, this isn't like the most inventive thing ever, but I was using a different process kind of inspired by like Steven's sketching. So I have this sketch underneath it that is really, really hard to see. Hold up.
You a Fate Zero fan?
I'm a Waver Velvet fan.
Yeah, he's a pretty well developed character.
Yeah. Oh God. All right, there we go. Jesus. So I had this sketch, which I'm actually going to put on 100% opacity and stick it up here. And then after that, I did the lines over that sketch. And then I used the pen tool to be able to color it. And it's not really a process I had ever used before, where it was just like really messy lines, really, which is strange because like that is kind of how my style is, where I am just kind of messy, but I always want to emulate like the very clean line style. And like, I want to emulate like the fully rendered, like, very well put together style, but it's really difficult for me. So.
Cool.
Yeah. So.
I just had a quick thought, but what it might be nice, since this would be an example of how like the digital process could be kind of an advantage. It might be nice to kind of copy out some of the underdrawing and then have it, just have it be next to it so we could even see the process even more,
Oh, sure. Like I actually just noticed a mistake here that I'm actually going to fix like right now.
Yeah.
So.
But it might be kind of cool just to pull a copy out, using the Option or Alt button and just drag it out. And that way,
oh, sure.
just kind of show that process a little bit. And so then it becomes something that you're like, oh, okay, hey, this is the finished thing. This is the,
okay. So yeah, let me do that. So. Oh, God. I'm still very obviously getting used to this. Okay. Oh, God, why won't it? Oh, because it's locked. So, like, here is my initial sketch, and I will turn up the opacity again.
Yeah, but that's cool. I mean, that'd be something that'd be kind of fun to just see, like, how it evolves. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Cool.
so, like, because I tend to, get so messy with my sketches, I grouped the entire sketch together and then drew over it in order to keep things clean.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Thanks, Tam.
Yeah, would anyone else like to share? I think that's kind of interesting. So Tam, you haven't done that kind of process before, right? With like sketchy lines and then these flat shapes underneath?
Yeah, I've never really had, like, I've never used a vector program before, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about how that also is like that process could be used like in other software too, like Photoshop or animation software. But this idea of just like these like really loose thin lines plus these solid shapes of color behind, it's kind of interesting how the sketchy lines actually make those solid shapes of color feel less kind of like clunky, like you would almost expect if you had really clean line work and then these sort of disconnected solid shapes, like the solid shapes would be like bleeding out or feel a little bit weird, but somehow the messiness of the lines with the solidness of those shapes like kind of works and looks good.
Thank you.
Cool. Whose is this? Kai's? Nice.
Kai, you're on mute, by the way.
Sorry. Yeah, this is basically a franchise, as you put, that I've been working on for a total of 3 years that I've revised over 20 times. It's a huge work in progress for me, and honestly, like this is a draft that I plan on scrapping. Even though I'd say it to date, it's one of my best ones.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah. I'll be sure to try and share like an extended version with other people. And here's a bunch of characters that I was developing.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Okay. If the people in the chat, if people actually are interested in helping me out with developing like the artwork for this series, maybe, then that would be great. Like,
Is it? Do you imagine this as a comic, as a film, as a?
I'm not gonna say I'm ambitious enough to think of it as a film. I would say at the least it could be like a good comic. I was originally planning to do a novel, since in my opinion I don't have the patience or the talent to really draw out this entire series as I through each frame. But if there ever is someone devoted enough to help me out with something like that, then that would be amazing.
Cool.
Because
I just want to say, like, a lot of the times when you want someone to illustrate something for you, they still need to be paid. Like, you might want to consider commissioning someone.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not gonna have them work for free or anything like that. And honestly, I'm not gonna have them like write the story for me. Like, it's still going to be I'm open to accepting advice and tips on like new characters or concepts or ideas, but in the end, I would ultimately prefer that I be the one to like complete the story. And
Yeah.
If you want to, you can
I could
share with me, because I can like I'm low-key I'll like offering my services as an editor.
Okay.
I can offer my services as an artist, because drawing more is always good for me, so that I can get better.
Yeah, and also it would
like,
now
I'm
help for me
currently
to also do a little bit of drawing, in that I need practice, but also it's like I want to learn how to do a comic.
All right.
Yeah, I'm currently drawing my comic, but it's not scanned in or anything, so I can't really show that yet. But I'm going to be redrawing a lot of it digitally now that I have my tablet with me. But I can show my script that I was working on for it, which was, I think it's very loose outline type of script that's done for comics, like the way comics are written tend to be. So I only have issue 1 scripted out in the right way, the way that I do it. And besides that, it's all like just the loose outline descriptions of pages that then have to be written out in a longer form. So like the first issue is, let's see, how many pages? 5 pages for that script.
Okay, and what does it mean if it's proper?
And then the actual drawings, I've done some of those, but I'm going to redraw like 90% of them. So I'll work for free. I've got nothing else to do, and I like drawing, so that's good.
Oh, don't work for free.
I won't.
That's literally the whole point.
I'm actually willing to. I would pay you, just nothing over $100.
Oh yeah,
That's totally fair. We're all broke ass college students. It's like, hey, if you like give someone like $5 for like.
I don't have a way to currently make money for drawing, because I just draw right now. I'm just drawing my own stuff, so I haven't really been doing much.
Yeah, it's some pretty good art there. Wait, did you draw that yourself?
Where? Which?
You're the Superman thing saying me help flatten curve.
No, that's a different artist. That's an artist that I like though.
Okay. No, that must be Bizarro then.
I see you, Caden. I don't know how to do commissions. I'm not good at that. Also, I'm scared of commissions. People will ask me.
Commissions are hard and scary.
Well,
that is true.
The thing about commissions is that because the artists are having the commissions open, you can actually set up not only like your commission rates, as in like, oh, this is how much I want to be paid for this service. You can identify what services you're offering, like if you're doing a portrait, a full body, or
I know that part. I just don't know the logistics of it.
Well, don't work for free.
I'm not working for free.
Setting up commissions, you can
I'm
also
not working at all right now.
What you can draw, what you specialize in, and what you absolutely will not draw. Like if you don't want to draw anything NSFW or kinky stuff or anything like that, you can you can put in your commission FAQ, hey, this is what I will absolutely not do.
Yeah.
Just use coffee
I
with
just
PayPal
don't-
or something. That's
The
usually
one
go-to.
problem is that if you want to join like the digital media industry, like video games or whatever, those like companies will try to get you to work for free. So you have to be, you know.
You have to advocate for yourself, put your foot down.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
They
was
will
just
try
saying,
to fuck you over.
I'll just chime in and to give some attention to the chat also. Lila is saying, I've been doing commissions online for years and I've got a few tips. Set up a price sheet list, set a firm terms of service to establish how you work and what you'll tolerate, and be willing to say no. You'll find a lot of assholes online who are demanding and unreasonable, and you as an artist do not need to accept their money. And that's true.
yeah.
I would also add to that to say that even in situations in which money or the acceptance or not of being paid is no longer part of the question, like someone's willing to pay you, you're willing to do the work, even at that point, there is a large responsibility on both parties. And I would say the main responsibility of someone who's commissioning an artist is to actually be able to really communicate well what that artist is supposed to be doing. So let's say you're designing, so let's say you're kind of in Kai's position as kind of a world builder, right? And so you have this world in your head that's like a literary world. It could eventually be, this world could eventually be used to create a number of media objects, whether a film or a novel or a comic or a TV show or a video game, right? Worlds can be used for all different kinds of outputs, right? And that's kind of one of the cool things about world building.
Yeah.
But because worlds can be so complicated and so huge and so dynamic, it can become really difficult to get somebody who's outside of that world building process to understand what their role is in it. So even if they're just drawing one character, it's like, and you're already paying them, it's like, well, how do you kind of communicate a small fraction of this world so that they just have the piece that they're able to understand?
Yeah. So
and not overwhelm their brain with
it's like a
everything.
Venn diagram, but without the middle.
Yeah, it's
it's
probably
exactly
be a tough
like
process.
That. Yeah, but it's a really important process because even when it comes to making artifacts from that world, like a Harry Potter movie versus a Harry Potter book versus a Harry Potter video game, those artifacts are extractions, right? Those artifacts are seductive extractions from that complicated world. And they're like, oh, there's this whole Harry Potter world. We're just showing you this one guy who likes to train animals in a briefcase right now. And that's really cool, you know? And so that becomes a great doorway to enter the world, right? And when you hire an artist or think about working with other people, you have to give them that doorway too.
Yeah, that's true. As long as you pretend like Crimes of Grindelwald didn't exist.
Yeah.
Honestly, I will say that there's like some things that just there's like an unholy trio of bad book to movie adaptations. Percy Jackson.
Twilight Saga?
Well, that implies that the books were good for the Twilight Saga, so that's a bold statement. No, continue.
Yeah,
no, the books were not good.
Airbender.
Maybe y'all could have this conversation after class. We still got like lecture to get to.
We still got a lecture, guys. Maybe we can save it for a chat section.
And actually, you know, we did.
I'm interested in it.
Yeah, and we also set up the Discord too, which I think could be a good place to have some of these conversations. I think they're really important conversations. You know, like starting to find what your particular interests and passions are, and this is really what the notebooks really are about. You know, is to
cardinal number of B, you add them together.
Is to
with.
Oops, someone's got their mic needs to mute. I think there. I'm not sure what that is, but so this is a big part of the notebooks is to start to follow.
Kai, you're not muted.
Okay.
there you go. So I think, yeah, so starting to follow your own particular interests, and then start to find people that are similarly inclined, I think is a really important part of that. And so definitely, make these connections, especially in this era of Zoom, Discord, isolation that we're in. So that's great. And a lot of people, I just, a couple of students that graduated in the past couple of years are working remotely, animators and designers and doing a lot of remote work. So this is a good thing to start to hone your skills in. So there was one other thing. Oh yeah, like just going back to what is the notebook? Well, how did we phrase it exactly, Jeffrey? So it came up as private public, but what we had a more elegant way of saying it, didn't we, yesterday?
Yeah, actually, I think the real question is just when and how do you share your work?
When and how do you share your work?
And are you doing it already? Are you doing it already or not?
And that's really the challenge of this, is at some point, it goes from being something that you're just doing for yourself into, this is part of my public presence, or part of kind of how I want to be seen or how I want to interact with people. And I think it's not as concrete as it sounds. I think that it's a way of being and interacting with people, I think, where your work really starts to become that. Yeah, I actually just took, I pulled one of my sketchbooks off the shelf from 2009. I think you guys were all born then, but I just randomly pulled it off and said, I wonder what's in here. And it's, I just took a couple of pictures of it just for the randomness, almost as a way to say, like, literally anything is okay to put in a notebook. And this notebook that I was doing, it was never intended to be public at all. So this was stuff that I was doing entirely for myself as a way to work things out. But it's interesting when it becomes public, like in sharing it, it starts to take on a different meaning to me, but also it becomes, now it's a way of communicating something about myself, to share it, and so that transformation is really interesting. We were talking the other day about, like, Schrodinger's cat. You guys heard of that postulate, and I think it's in physics, but I don't really understand it very well. But the idea is that it's possible that in measuring something, you change the thing itself. So I think, what is it, light? That's either it's a particle or it's a wave, and you can't measure both properties at the same time, or, like, it's impossible to determine the position of an electron in space or something like that. So that there are these weird things that start to happen. So that the Schrodinger's cat idea is, like, if the cat's in a box and you're not measuring the cat, does the cat still exist? Kind of. And I think that's the way it's true for us, how we might do something. Like, if I take this drink of coffee, and if I were to do that off camera by myself, like, that act would kind of vanish. It wouldn't be something. But now it's like I've done it in front of a group of people, that takes on this kind of meaning. What the meaning is, no one knows particularly, but it takes on a significance because it's part of this kind of larger network, so to speak. So, I thought I could just throw a few of these up on the screen. But before I do that, Jeffrey, did you want to say something about this kind of, when do you share your work?
Yeah, I mean, on the Schrodinger's cat example, I mean, the basic idea there is that when you're being observed, you behave differently. And when you're not being observed, from a media point of view, you don't exist. So there's a tension between surveillance and being watched, and also performing, right? and you perform because you're being watched. And that's just part of what being an artist is about, right? It's about other people looking in on you and you deciding what and when to share things, and when the camera turns on or off, and when the page gets shown or not. And so the tension of the public and private is really always been a part of what artists do, and it's something that, you know, everybody has to decide on for themselves. But it's a really deep thing to think about, because there are all different kinds of ways in which you can mine that space for content and for meaning, you know. There's been like so many art projects in the last century that have really been about like what it means for private things to become public and how those things are shown. But not just art projects, you know, not just kind of like weird art stuff, like companies too. You know, the most powerful companies today were experiments in that, right? And the history of media technology is also an experiment in that, right? Like when you have to go out and you leave a note saying like, you know, like BRB or whatever, right? You're engaging in a drawing process in which you're taking something that was private and you're making it public, right? You're posting, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a post-it note. But at that point in time, you've made the decision to share something, right? And in that sharing, even that sharing of that note can make you vulnerable, right? Like, you know, the stalker who's stalking you could somehow see the note if it was on the outside of your house or something like that, right? Someone could take a picture of it. Someone could steal it, right? So it's like in the sharing of something, you also become vulnerable. But often it's those moments of vulnerability that get shared and described and really well that are the things that we love about the things that we like. You know, like the best movie you watch, the best book you've read, it's often about those moments. And so being good at doing that is part of what it means to not necessarily be good at drawing or be good at constructing like things, but being good at like creating meaning in your work and understanding sort of like what it is that you actually have to say.
Cool. Yeah, it's such a weird thing. I think about it because I'm old enough that I grew up pre-digital. So, you know, if I have a book and I look at the book, you know, if I go, oh, that's cool, and I hold the book closer to my face, that doesn't exist as a data moment. You know, that's just something that I did in my house that no one will ever know. But if you're on your phone and you see an image, you're, oh, that's cool, and you like zoom in on that exists as data. Like you've created like a data experience for someone else to track. Like everything that you're doing online is, or even on a computer now, is really basically being recorded as information. So whereas before, if I like turned to page 13, that didn't exist. You know, I could do this and it doesn't exist as a data object, but now everything is kind of this data object. And so part of the challenge, I think, of as artists is that we're trying to deal with the world that's constantly shifting and fluctuating and is being recorded, and everything is very, how do you represent the nature of that is one of the things that I think as artists we're really confronted with. Cool. Well, I'll just show a few of these. I'll share the screen here in a second, but just one quick note on being observed and sharing is that probably you all are familiar with this experience, but the thing that when things get really political in this space is when you're performing unknowingly, right? So when you're being surveyed or recorded, or something is being shared, but you're not aware that you're a performer or an actor in that situation. Like, for example, if someone's secretly filming you, or, you know, taking screenshots of your DMs or whatever, you know, to use like a contemporary example. So there's these moments in which you might think something is private, and then that thing might become public or might be shared.
And those are kind of the scary moments, right? When you don't know the camera's on, but you're somehow performing just in this space where you're not creative, or you're not thinking about constructing the thing that you're creating. And I think that's a really big tension right now in culture, because literally every single thing you do online could be taken and is basically